welcome to Beerstories from Beerstories Brewhouse. I'm standing outside my beer cave, and in here I've prepared a Zoom meeting with Lars Marius Garshol, who's a Norwegian author and expert in farmhouse brewing. The way they did in the old days. Some people might know him as regarding Kveik yeast. But actually, he knows a lot about farmhouse brewing in Denmark as well. So we're going to talk to him about Danish beer from 5,000 years ago up until Carlsberg came along in about 1880. So let's go in and see what he has to say. Hi Lars, thank you for seeing me, or through Zoom anyway.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. You have a really interesting background, I think. As a beer geek, I've heard your name mentioned quite a lot of times, especially regarding Kveik yeast. And then I listened to a podcast with you. I think, was it Brewlosophy or maybe
Could
the
be.
Brew Lab, or where you talked about old style farming brewing or beer, and in that podcast you also said that you've researched this old style of brewing, both in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and other countries as well.
Yeah, in Denmark there are at least two different institutes that researched the farmhouse brewing.
Yeah.
So one is quite surprising. It's the Department for Dialect Research at the University of Copenhagen. Udvalg for Folkemål, as it's called. Yeah. They did a dictionary of the island dialects.
Yeah.
And they had this belief that if you really want to understand what a word means, when it refers to something, some activity, you have to really understand the activity. So they had this questionnaire of how do the farmers brew, and they sent it out to, I don't know, 50, 60 different farmers.
Yeah.
And then the ethnographic Nationalmuseets etnografiske undersøgelser, they had also a questionnaire, and they have a giant pile of information at the National Museum in Copenhagen. So I went there 3 times, I think, and just copied as much information as I could.
Okay. Yeah. So what's your background for talking about old school farmhouse beer and brewing? What's your background?
Well, I mean, my authority for saying what the brewing was like is having been to these archives, really. Yeah. But my professional background is I used to be a software engineer, like a standard IT developer.
Okay.
And then on the beer side, I was just a beer enthusiast. I used to use rate beer a lot.
Yeah.
Took a beer judging exam, but most of the farmhouse brewing I've just taught myself.
Okay. And you actually did quite a lot of research in this field of farmhouse brewing. You wrote a book about it, or what was it?
Well, I've written, I guess, 3 books about it.
Okay, 3 books, yeah.
Yeah. Well, 4, because there's one coming this spring.
Yeah.
But I did a lot of research. Yeah. So I did the same archive digging in Norway and also in Sweden, and to some extent Estonia.
Okay.
I also did a lot of travel to Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, lots of places in Norway.
Yeah.
Also to Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah, cool. And why do you have this interest in farmhouse brewing? It's kind of, as a beer geek, I can understand it, but my interest is beer in general. I think it's fascinating how they brewed in the old days, but why did that capture you so much?
Well, to begin with, I think I was thinking the same as you. I was interested in beer in general.
Yeah.
But that started in maybe 2001. So, after a decade and a half of just beer in general, well, it was actually shorter than that before I discovered farmhouse brewing. And what really drew me into it was the mystery. Because, you find that it looks like maybe it exists, then you try the beers and they are just so different from anything you've ever had. And of course you wonder, okay, so why then?
Yeah.
How do they brew? Where does this still exist? And nobody can tell you.
No.
Right. And you want to know, what is the history of this? Why are the beers like this? And nobody can tell you that either.
No.
So it was really the mystery that drew me in. And then when you start researching it, the discoveries and the new questions just keep coming all the time. So it just kept my interest up because it's such a gigantic subject, basically.
Yeah, it is. I've read quite a lot about how they brewed beer from like the 1500s, but most of the literature you can find when searching for Danish beer is how they brewed inside the walls of Copenhagen.
Yeah.
They had over 100 breweries inside the walls of Copenhagen, and they couldn't brew beer at all. They had poor water until Carlsberg was founded at Valby Bakke.
But they must have brewed beer if they had 100 breweries.
Yeah, they brewed beer, but they were bad beer. To some extent, they had bad water anyway.
Yes.
Really bad water. Some probably made good beer. I don't know, but
it was certainly very different beer.
Yeah. And then Carlsberg kind of was founded and took over the Danish beer scene. So when people in Denmark think about beer and Danish beer, they think about Carlsberg. So that whole history from about 1850 and before that, all that history is kind of forgotten or gone. And we have such a huge history in Denmark with brewing beer. Egtvedpigen, she is about 5,000 years old or whatever, and she was actually buried with some kind of Berliner Weisse fruited sour beer. With
I think comparing it with Berliner Weisse is it gives you completely the wrong idea.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, but with the beer that there was some wheat in, absolutely.
Yeah. It was probably a sour beer because there was a lot of berries in it too, but honey and.
Well, why would that make it sour?
I don't know. It's just today it's a sour beer.
Oh yeah, but that's because they decided the fruit flavors go with sour flavor.
Yeah.
We don't know that they were thinking that way 3,500 years ago.
No, probably not.
So maybe it was sour. We don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, but and I kind of wanted to talk to you about that gap from Egtvedpigen to Carlsberg because I don't know much about that. I've visited Frilandsmuseet in Copenhagen, where they have all these old houses they collected from all over Denmark and built them in kind of a outdoor museum.
Right.
And you see in all of these old houses, they have kind of a brewery. They have a bryggers where the women they brew beer, and that's kind of it. That's all I know about that because there's not a lot of information to read about it. So
no, it's very hard to find. There is a little bit, but it's very hard to find, and it's not in the places where you would look for beer information.
No, probably not. Yeah. So how did the Danish farmers brew beer in the old days?
Well, how many hours do you have? So the thing is, the old farmhouse brewers did not read textbooks. Brewing was something you learned from your parents.
Yeah.
So there was just an infinity of different methods, basically.
Yeah.
Just the variation is just mind-blowing. But most of them made their own malts. So it was their own grain that they were brewing from. And of course, that's why they were brewing, right? They didn't have to pay anything to brew.
No.
And for the most part, what they made was beer that was never boiled. So what's called raw ale.
Yeah.
It's quite unusual in Denmark to boil the wort. And they used very simple wooden equipment. There would be a kettle that was bricked in, a couple of wooden tubs, and a wooden barrel. It's quite similar to, if you've read about Norwegian brewing, if you take out the juniper, it would be very similar.
Yeah.
But one big difference was that in Denmark, it was very common to use, or not very common, but it was common to use wormwood, malurt, in the beer.
Yeah.
Most people had that growing in their gardens, and quite a few of them used it in their beer.
And also pors, right? Pors, or what's it called?
Historically they must have used it. But when we look at the more recent data, one brewer in 20, it seems.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was used, but it wasn't common.
No. So malurt was the most common?
Yes, apparently, yeah.
Okay.
Well, unless you want to count hops, of course.
Yeah. But when did they start using hops? That was quite late, right? In the 1200 or so?
No. There are archaeological finds of what they think are hops from brewing in Denmark from the 8th century.
Okay.
That doesn't mean they started in the 8th century. It just means there's no evidence before that.
No.
But it seems that at the time of hjemmebryg and also the earlier brewers than that, there's no sign of hops there.
No.
So probably 500-600s, and probably started in the trading towns first, and then spread from there.
Yeah. And when did hops then take over? Was that in the around 1200 or 1400?
I don't know, but I think that it seems that the original way to use herbs in the beer, whichever herb it was that you put the herbs in the mash, together with the malt, and you add hot water. And when you extract the sugar from the malts, you also extract the flavor from the herbs at the same time.
Yeah.
If you use hops in this way, you don't get any bitterness. And you also don't get very good protection against infection. Not like you do when you boil the hops.
Exactly, because they didn't boil it.
Well, there's a trick here. So if you look at the modern farmhouse brewing, what they did was they would boil the hops in water and then pour that into the beer. For the most part, not everyone, but for the most part.
Okay.
So it's likely that they started using hops by just putting it in the mash, didn't get a huge effect out of it. And so probably, the beginning of hop use was it wasn't like everyone switched to hops at the same time. And then when they figured out this with boiling, that probably speeded up the transition, but we don't know when that happened.
Okay.
So there's an important piece of context here, and that is that the big metal kettles for brewing used to be extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Like the first metal kettles were not used for cooking or for brewing at all. They were so expensive, they were just showpieces that you would serve drink out of.
Okay.
And even as late as, say, the 1400s, unless you were a rich farmer, you didn't have a kettle. Not a big one. It's just out of reach. So this thing with not boiling the wort and the strange way of treating the hops, that all comes out of people not having kettles. But I don't know when those became widespread in Denmark. It's kind of hard to research.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, when they brew beer, they took all the malts and the spices and just put everything in, and then poured hot water over it and let it steep.
Well, now it depends what time you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So some people did it like that as late as 1900.
Yeah.
And when they got kettles, that's probably the way most of them brewed to begin with. But if you don't have a kettle, how are you going to heat the water that you pour on?
Yeah.
So the original way of brewing was probably with hot stones.
Yeah.
So you put the malts and the water and the herbs into cold water in a wooden tub, and then you heat stones in a fire and you drop those in.
Yeah. Interesting.
And that way of brewing was still alive in Denmark when they did the ethnographic survey.
Okay.
So there is a description of people brewing that way from southwest Jutland, Hunderup.
Okay.
Yeah.
So still today they're brewing. There's some
No,
people.
not now, but 100 years ago, yes.
100 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
But what about today? Is there anyone still brewing old school beer like that?
Yes. There are people in Fyn.
Yeah.
Mostly on the north side, to some extent on the west.
Yeah.
They're quite hard to find. And then there is one woman on Møn.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Who's still brewing, and she actually sells the beer as well.
Okay.
So she's quite easy to. You can just go there and talk to her.
Yeah. Interesting. And so they also brew like as a no boil, like they did, or have they modernized?
She wouldn't tell me because she wanted to start selling the beer, but I'm pretty sure she doesn't boil. Yes.
Yeah.
At least it tasted that way, and that was the traditional way on Møn. I see that from other descriptions.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So those beer, if it's not, what would you describe that beer as if you were to compare it to kind of a modern beer style? Or
right? There is no modern beer style to really compare with. It's too different for that.
Yeah.
And also there's a difference between the beer that people make now and the beer that they made a century ago. But if we talk about the classic beer that they made a century ago, most of it was smoked.
Yeah,
quite heavily smoked.
Yeah, it was the only way to kind of dry the malts or kill the malts.
Nah, not really. It's just for some. Well, it's not hard to make malt which is not smoked. You just dry it in the sun.
Yeah. Okay.
And in Northwest Jutland, that's what people did.
Yeah.
And there's also ways of drying it that give you just a lightly smoked malt. But for some reason, they didn't do that. I don't really know why. So that would have been a huge difference. Another.
When are we talking here? Is that 500 years ago or?
No. If you go to this Frilands Museum again,
yeah,
and you look more closely, you'll see the malt kilns there. Those were in use in 1900.
Okay.
And a very common way to build it was that you had the big oven in the bryggers.
Yeah.
Bryggers.
Yeah.
And you have the fireplace, just like normal, right? But in the chimney, there would be an opening, a door basically into the chimney. And there was this construction where you could put the malts to dry them, and underneath would be this kind of pyramid that would keep the sparks from the fire from setting fire to the malts.
Okay, so that's.
But there were other types of kilns as well that where you had a side channel to the chimney that led to this drying surface on the top floor.
Okay.
And there were other methods than that as well. But this was part of every Danish farm.
Yeah,
basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everyone had this type of drying equipment.
Yeah. And is it true it was mostly women who brewed?
It seems to have been all women in Denmark.
Yeah. Is that different in Norway and Sweden?
Sweden was also all women, but Norway had a divide. Western Norway, it was men who brewed, and Eastern Norway was women.
Okay.
In fact, Eastern Norway, mostly women. When you get into places that are quite remote, suddenly it's men. So it looks like it used to be all men, but there's no sources for that. It's impossible to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you were asking what the beer was like, and we kind of sidetracked. So the big thing that you would notice would first be the smoke.
Yeah.
And then the second thing you would notice would be the absence of carbonation.
Yeah.
So it would be like an English cask ale.
Yeah.
And it would be not, well, this varies, but some of them would seem sweet because there would be so little hops. But in other cases, there would be a lot of hops, actually.
Okay.
And then, of course, the flavor from wort that isn't boiled. That would also strike you quite powerfully, I think.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I think I have to. Can you give me a recipe so I can?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sure. There's recipes in my book and for Danish beer. Yeah. But I can send you one as well. It's no problem.
Yeah, that would be cool. Can I publish it in the description of the video?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Cool. I'll do that. Yeah, and also send me some links to your books. That would be really awesome.
Yeah. It's only one that has information about Danish beer, but I'll show you. Yeah.
Perfect. So what kind of yeast did they use? Was it kind of like a Kveik yeast, or is that especially in Norway?
Big question. So they historically everyone had their own yeast in the same way as the Kveik brewers. But in Norway they dried the yeast, and in Denmark they usually didn't. Because in Denmark you brewed once a month or every other week.
Yeah.
So it barely had time to dry before you would use it again.
Okay.
But we don't know anything about it genetically. Was it related to Kveik, or was it something completely different? We just don't know.
No.
What we do know.
What?
What we do know is that it fermented at the same temperatures, just as hot.
Kveik. Okay.
Yep, exactly the same. That was the same all over Europe.
Yeah.
It was the same in England. It was the same in Russia. It was the same in anywhere you like.
Okay.
And also the very fast fermentation, like Kveik.
Okay.
But what were the flavors? We have no idea. Absolutely no clue at all.
But okay, so it was this kind of wild yeast?
No, not wild. Kveik is not wild yeast, and neither was the Danish.
Okay.
This is this is a complete misconception. So if you look at for Kveik, we've been able to study this very closely, and one thing is it's in the same family of yeast as modern ale yeast.
Yeah.
Whose closest relative in the tree is actually Hefeweizen yeast.
Okay.
But that's misleading. But what it really tells you is this is just as domesticated as any other brewer's yeast. And if you look at how people use Kveik today, you can the fit between how they use it and the genetics of the yeast are incredible. It's like a lock and a key. Yeah. This yeast is exquisitely adapted to being used the way that it's being used.
Yeah.
And it must have been the same with the Danish yeast. It can't have been different in that regard.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and that's probably because maybe 2,000 more or 5,000 years ago they had this wild yeast, and the way they used it is it kind of mutated into Kveik. Yes. Or kind of farmhouse ale. Yeah.
Yes. So it was domesticated when they it was domesticated when they were reusing it, basically. Yeah. So it adapted to their brewing. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I wonder if Carlsberg or any of the laboratories actually have got some kind of old Danish farm yeast.
I asked them, and the answer I got from Carlsberg was that they have an insane number of yeast strains in their collection. And then he looked at me and said, but the index is cards. You can't search it. It's paper cards.
Okay.
So he said they are digitizing it, but
okay.
so I'm sure somebody is going through that index now, thinking, do we have anything? But I haven't heard anything.
No. Okay.
But they might well have. It wouldn't be surprising if they did.
No. Because I know they made this rebrew from 1883, and that yeast, they are actually not using that yeast in the production beer now, because I did an interview with them, but it's a very, very similar yeast, but it wasn't the quality wasn't as good as it could be. So, but they have that yeast from 1883, the original Carlsberg yeast.
Yeah.
They probably have something from before that. They made the laboratory in 1875, I think, and they started collecting yeast at that time, actually.
So even before 1883, okay. Because 1883 is the year that they did their major yeast research and kind of revolutionized the use of yeast in brewing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, interesting. I have a contact in that. I think I'll try to write him and see if.
Yeah, please do, and please let me know what he says.
Yeah. If do you know any traditions from Denmark? Because in the podcast where you talked about Norwegian farmhouse brewing, you talked a lot about some of the traditions that when the brewers they had a party every time beer was finished and stuff like that. And I know in the Danish language we have words like bryggers that's directly related to beer. In English it would just be brewery, I think, or brewers actually. And a word like maternity leave in Danish is barsel. That means child's beer, barns øl. We have all these kind of hidden words in the Danish language that are directly related to beer in somehow. So we have all these traditions that are kind of forgotten. Do you know some of those traditions that we forgot, other than barns øl?
It looks like the role of beer in Danish peasant society was different from how it was in Norway.
Yeah.
Because in Norway you would brew once or twice a year, and then for special occasions.
Okay.
But so in Denmark,
they had the big parties every time.
Well, it really was an occasion when you brew the beer. But in Denmark, beer was the daily drink. It was what you drank for thirst every single day of your life.
Yeah.
So the tradition in Denmark was that on the kitchen table, there would always be a beer mug, 1 or 2 liters, with beer. And if you were thirsty, you just went to the beer mug and you drank. And if it was empty, you went to the barrel in the cellar and you filled it up again.
Yeah.
And if the barrel was empty, then your ma had to brew, basically. So this meant that this air of the beer being an unusual treat was not the same, but there were still traditions around it. So one thing was that everybody brewed for Christmas, and you would usually brew a stronger beer for Christmas.
Yeah.
But the kind of the legendary Danish beer that the farmers really remember as something special was what they called gammelt old beer.
Yeah.
Which you would brew in March or April, typically with double the amount of malts that you used for the normal beer.
Yeah.
And also double the amount of hops. And then you would store it through the summer, and you would drink it after the grain harvest in the autumn.
Yeah, so kind of
So there's quite a few descriptions of people having personal traditions around when you open this barrel.
Yeah.
So then the
and stuff like that, maybe.
Yeah, some people say that the neighbors would come over and then they would open the barrel of Gammeltal, and maybe the kids would be there, but they would be forbidden to speak. So they could sit there and watch the adults drink this beer, but they couldn't say anything, and they wouldn't get anything.
Okay.
And there's some of these traditions that are described from Norway of a lot of the special occasions that you would brew beer for, that must have existed in Denmark as well, as you see through the existence of the word borsel. But I don't know of any descriptions of it.
Okay.
So I think the Denmark in general seems a lot more modern than Norway, unsurprisingly, I would say.
Yeah.
And also this different role of the beer, I think, obliterated some of the traditions earlier, basically.
Okay. Yeah, it must be at the harvest party, because every in the fall when all the harvest and all the crops were taken in to store, they had these big parties, and maybe that was when they opened old beer.
That's what it was for.
Yeah,
and I think the reason that you were brewing it in the spring is that brewing during the summer was more risky. The beer more often turned sour. You didn't want to risk this, and therefore,
yeah. So how did they store it or condition it?
So they would ferment for 1 or 2 days, and then they would transfer the beer from the fermenter, which was just an open tub with a cloth or something over it, into the barrel. And when they transferred it, it wasn't completely finished fermenting. So we would ferment a little bit more in the cask, which is important because if you have oxygen on top of the beer, it's going to get moldy.
Okay, so they knew that.
Yes, they knew that. They knew all of these things.
Yeah.
But
how did they measure that? Because
this was really a skill to be able to see when the beer was at the right stage of fermentation.
Yeah.
And a very common way to do it was to take a ladle and move it through the foam. And if the foam closed up again after the ladle, then you weren't done yet. Whereas if this furrow stayed open, then it was time.
Yeah, and it was an open fermentation?
Well, there was a cloth over it typically.
Okay.
But nothing more than that. You wanted it to be able to breathe, but you didn't want insects and stuff like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So when you move it into the barrel, it ferments a little bit, adds a layer of CO2 on top, and then when you can tell that it's stopped, you close the barrel. So usually there is a wooden piece that you insert, but to make it really airtight, they would make this dough out of grain and also often ash, and use that to really attach this properly.
Okay.
And then some pressure might build up in the cask, but nothing like what we're used to in carbonated beer.
Oh.
And then they would wait perhaps a week if they could, or if they couldn't, they would just drink it right away.
Yeah.
Because they were drinking beer all day, every day, right?
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So you said that there still are some farmhouse brewers out there, but when does it disappear in general in Denmark?
It seems that until late 1800s, people were brewing everywhere in Denmark, like every single farm.
Yeah.
And then from 1880, 1890 onwards, it seems to have started to die out.
Yeah.
And it's partly the availability of commercial beer that drove this.
Yeah.
But they never stopped completely, because the beer that they made didn't taste like the beer that you could buy.
No.
And so it seems that not everyone was happy with the commercial beer. They preferred their own. And so some people just never stopped. They still haven't stopped.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. But do you know what kind of hops they used? Because my neighborhood, there's a lot of wild hops everywhere. We have this green area around where I live, and there are wild hops everywhere. I have 3 wild hops in my garden, and then 3 I planted myself. And just out on our streets, in the lampposts, there are wild hops growing up there. So they're everywhere in Denmark if you look.
It seems to have been extremely easy to grow in Denmark. Well,
but the wild hops here can't really be used for brewing. I've tried tea out of them. They have no bitterness and no real flavor. Not very much anyway.
That's strange because So in southeast Denmark, so southeast Jutland, all of Funen, the South Islands, and the south half of Zealand, people grew their own hops.
Yeah.
That they used in the beer, and they definitely made bitter beer with it. What the aroma was like, I don't know.
No.
But northern Zealand and western Jutland and North Jutland, people bought the hops.
Okay.
And what's interesting is there was a huge, well, not huge, but there was a big industry growing hops on Funen, particularly western Funen.
Yeah.
And the farmers themselves would be the ones selling the hops. So once everything was harvested and dried, they would pack it into bags on a wagon, set off for other parts of Denmark. And typically they would travel the exact same route every year. Very often they would stay with the same people on the same farms every single year as well.
Yeah.
And the annual tradition even extended to telling the same joke every single year.
Okay.
So they would roll onto the farm and shout, best Funen hops. My wife has brewed with them twice and they're still just as good. There's even a woman who records that she heard this the first time when she was 10 years old.
Yeah.
And standing next to her dad, she says to the hop trader, well, then we can brew with them again. And she says, I got a good smack for that. Apparently the wrong answer.
Yeah.
So this was actually a Danish beer tradition. The traders traveling around selling these hops. And from what I've read, they seem to have made, for the time, a lot of money from this. Like that was a really lucrative trade.
Okay.
But see, it seems to have ended around the First World War, roughly.
Yeah. Yeah, I read that too somewhere. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it's interesting. You could probably brew with the wild hops I have around here, but if you smell them, there's almost no aroma to them.
But it depends on when you pick them, right? Are you picking them late enough?
Yeah, in late September or mid-September. Yeah,
should be late enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Compared to my northern brewer, I have a East Kent Golding that's also pretty aromatic, and then I have a Cascade. It doesn't really work here in Denmark, and then another brewer, and they are at least 4 times as powerful, I think, as a wild hop.
Okay, but in general, I don't think you can try one wild hop and say, because I don't think they're completely wild. They're kind of semi-wild, probably.
Yeah.
But from what I know, the genetics of these are extremely variable. There's probably more variation in Danish hops than there is in all of continental hops put together.
Okay.
So if you get a different plant, it can be completely different.
Yeah.
But this woman, I'll send you her contact information in Møn.
Yeah.
She has 3 or 4 Danish varieties of hops growing.
Okay.
So you can talk to her as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and also in Hårdrup on Fyn, there is a museum to Danish hop growing.
Okay, interesting. I didn't
so
know that.
That's also worth visiting.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, when you visit Frilandsmuseet, they have these. Every house had these large wooden
poles.
Yeah, for hops. So they put their own hops as well. Every farm.
Yeah, it seems that it wasn't that you had to tend these plants, you had to keep them from taking over the garden for the most part, it seems. And there's even one archive document where a woman says that my grandpa tore up the hops 50 years ago, but they're still coming out of the ground in the same spot.
Yeah.
So even 50 years of trying to kill them wasn't enough.
No. Oh, yeah, cool. Well, Lars, I guess that was it. It was really interesting to learn more about the Danish farm beer, and I'm definitely gonna research some more.
Great.
About it, I think, and maybe get an interview with some of those who still do it that way.
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, and also try and make one out of your recipe. I think.
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Yeah, that would be very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me know how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah, I will. Cool. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, cool. It was super interesting to talk to Lars about old farmhouse ale or beer in Denmark. Actually, they were ales. Also, the English word for ale comes from the Danish alu, that we actually what we call beer when the Vikings were alive. So yeah, that's really interesting. And this is a kind of a forgotten time in Danish beer history up until Carlsberg came along. So it's part of our culture. It's still in our language, Basel, bryggers, and these words that we still use today. And it's actually part of our beer culture from 1,000 years ago. So that was really interesting. If you stick around to the end, there'll be 2 videos up here that YouTube wants you to see. If you don't want to miss out on anything, click like and subscribe down in the corner. You get the newest videos in your YouTube feed, and make sure that you don't miss anything from Beerstories. And you will also help out the channel. If you want, you can subscribe to Instagram and Facebook as well. And if you have any questions, you can write to me through in the commentaries down below, or Facebook, Instagram, or my website beerstories.dk. Other than that, well, just have a happy brewing out there.